In this video, we're going to show you a few ways to how to tell what to do if you multiply, divide, add or subtract, or solve rational expressions. So the first thing we're going to look at is multiplying rational expressions. So we got 3 steps here. The first is to factor the numerator and denominator. So if you look at the example below, we look at what can be factored. That's your first step. Once you have it factored, you just multiply straight across. And lastly, you cross out any common factors. So we're going to do that with this example below. So you notice that in the numerator of the first fraction, 4n plus 8 both have 4 in common, so we can factor out a 4, leaving us with n plus 2. And if you look in the denominator, we have -6, and we need to think of a number that multiplies to give us that, but will add up to -1. So that can be factored as a +2 and a -3. So we have n plus 2 times n minus 3. And you'll probably already notice that something's going to cancel in that first fraction. Then we do the same thing in that second fraction. Notice that we have an 8, so we have to think of factors of 8 that add up to 9. That one's pretty obvious, that 1 times 8 gives you 8, and 1 plus 8 is 9. And then also, so we've got n plus 1 times n plus 8. And lastly, that denominator, 4n plus 32, both have a 4 in common as well. If you factor a 4 out, you're left with n plus 8. So now the fun part, you can cancel stuff. So I see that I have the n plus 2's match here, the n plus 8's match in the second fraction, and these 4's match as well. In the numerator, we're left with n plus 1, and the denominator, we're left with n minus 3. The second example we're going to look at is division, which is very similar to these 3 steps here. There's just one extra step at the beginning. So let's take a look. First thing is we follow keep, switch, flip, which we learned in class. You keep the first fraction the same, you switch division to multiplication, and then you flip that second fraction. So let's turn this problem down below into a multiplication problem, and then we can follow the steps from above. So we still have a squared minus 12a plus 20 over a minus 10. We're going to keep that. We're going to switch to multiplication and flip the second fraction. So once we've done that first step, we can follow the steps above for multiplying. So that's what we'll do to finish up this problem. All right, so notice that we only have one piece that we can factor. We can factor that first numerator. So we're thinking of 2 numbers that multiply to give us 20 and add up to -12. And I'll let you think about that for a moment before I spoil it for you. And it's -2 and -10. So we can factor this first fraction as a minus 2 times a minus 10. That's going to be all over a minus 10. And then we're multiplying by a minus 4 over a minus 2. And look at that. These a minus 2's are going to cancel. So are these a minus 10's. And we can reduce this entire problem down to a minus 4. All right. So here comes the most challenging part of chapter 9, adding and subtracting, because we have to find common denominators here. Our first step is exactly like the steps from multiplying. We factor, but in this case we're only going to factor the denominators. So we factor the denominator completely. And once that's factored, you have to figure out what your least common denominator is. Then you're going to obtain that least common denominator. So you have to figure out what to multiply the first fraction by and what to multiply the second fraction by. Once you have that least common denominator, you can combine your like terms on the top. So any like terms that you have in the numerator, you should combine. All right, so let's try that out with this example down below. I notice that my LCD is x minus 1 times x minus 2. You can just multiply the numerators together. So to figure out that LCD, I notice I have to multiply the first fraction's numerator and denominator by the other fraction's denominator, x minus 2. So using that same idea, we can multiply the second fraction by the first fraction's denominator, x minus 1. And if you look at the denominator that we created, it's that LCD that we pointed out below, x minus 1 times x minus 2. All right, so then in our numerators, we can distribute this 3 to the x minus 2. It's going to give us 3x minus 6. And we can distribute this 4 to the x minus 1. So we're going to add 4x minus 4. And now notice we have 3x plus 4x, our common denominators, our common terms, as well as this negative 6 minus 4. So if we combine our like terms, we're ending up with 7x minus 10 all over x minus 1 times x minus 2. And if you look in your numerator, there's nothing we can take out of both 7x and 10, so this is our final answer. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is solving rational expressions, which still works with this idea of the least common denominator. So here's 4 steps for you. Just like in adding and subtracting, you factor your denominators completely. And once you have that common denominator, or once you have those factored, you have to determine what your common denominator will be. Once you have that least common denominator, that's what you multiply just the tops of the fractions by. So you multiply the tops by that least common denominator. Then we cancel out all of our denominators, and it's just solving from there. So cancel your denominators and solve just like you would any equation. All right, so if we look down here, notice that we can factor these denominators on the right side of the equation. 6x squared plus 2x both have 2x in common. If we take 2x out, we're left with 3x plus 1 for both of those denominators. So let's replace the 6x squared plus 2x and cross those out. So that is our biggest denominator, and what we talked about in class is that is always your LCD, whatever the biggest denominator is. So 2x times the quantity 3x plus 1 is what we're going to multiply all of the tops of this fraction by. We're going to multiply 2 by 2x times 3x plus 1, as well as the 1 here. And this entire expression in the last fraction, 2x times 3x plus 1, will multiply by that whole thing. So we can cancel out quite a bit here. In the first fraction, 3x plus 1 cancels out 3x plus 1. 2x and 3x plus 1 cancel in the second two fractions. And then all we have left is 2 times 2x for that first fraction gives us 4x. And then that's going to equal 1, is all we have for that second fraction, minus x minus 6. So this equation won't be so bad to solve. We can add this x over to the left side of the equation. So those cancel. We're left with 5x equals 1 minus 6 is negative 5. So we can see x has to be -1. And lastly, before we finish, let's just check that that's not going to make any of the denominators 0. And we can see that -1 works out okay, so this is a good solution. All right, I hope that gave you some clarity on the different types of rational expressions that we worked with and how you can multiply, divide, add, and subtract, and then solve those rational equations.